Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from CHVRCHES called Love Is Dead. So I was worried about this album. Actually, worried isn't quite the right terminology there, because that implies a level of uncertainty that something wouldn't turn out to the standards we all expect and hope from CHVRCHES, who, at least to me, they've hit two line drives out of the park with their first two albums. Now, many cite their 2013 record, The Bones of What You Believe, as the stronger release, with a sharper, garish, early 80s inspired synths, but I actually stand behind their 2015 follow-up, Every Open Eye, as the better album. The gloss had been buffed into a mirror shine, the lyrics were focusing more of the abstract narrative into a more emotionally nuanced package, and the hooks, they were easily among some of the best in synthpop of the 2010s. Now, both records would wind up making year-end list of albums for me, but it was Every Open Eye that broke my top 10 of the best albums of 2015, and for damn good reason. It holds up to this day. But I did have a real concern coming out of that sophomore album, and that was, in essence, CHVRCHES had basically just copied their own formula, including much of the thematic arc from their debut album, and I at least had the concern that they could fall into that same trap yet again for Love Is Dead, until I saw the production credits for this album. A switch in labels to Glassnote put them in with producer Greg Kurstin, the first time that any of their albums had not been produced entirely in-house, which sure could net them a very different sound, but Greg Kurstin's had a bad habit in recent years of suffocating his mixes and reverb, and even if CHVRCHES was acknowledging they were heading towards more pop conventionality, maybe even towards the mainstream, it would require a very delicate balance to do so without compromising a lot of their sound and style. But hey, if this was their big mainstream pop swing, they had been primed for this off of Every Open Eye, so maybe Love Is Dead could work, right? Well, yes and no. And here's the thing, there is a baseline of quality for me that comes with a CHVRCHES album in terms of their sound and performance that will naturally work, taking their proto-stock Aiken and Waterman synthpop into content that consistently punches higher than many in their established genre, all helped along by Lauren Mayberry's very stridently earnest and charming presence. But at the same time, if there is an album that shows CHVRCHES paradoxically changing too much in some directions and not enough in the others, it's Love Is Dead, which I would hesitate to call so much of an open play for the mainstream as some have implied, because normally in order to win that crowd you have to manufacture sweeter hooks and buff the synthesizers even cleaner, not devolve into more turgid sounds that you get across a surprising amount of this album. And yet again, it's not enough to make this a bad or even mediocre album, but it is enough to make this a considerable step back from what made CHVRCHES so damn compelling for me in the first place. In other words, not by an insignificant margin, I'd argue this is their worst album to date. And spoiler alert, a significant chunk of the blame will fall on Greg Kurstin. And while, to his credit, he doesn't so much suffocate the album in reverb, the telltale signs of his production choices, they're all over this album and cannot help but diminish CHVRCHES' overall sound. See, for as much as a lot of critics have ranted that CHVRCHES can feel kind of one-dimensional in their sound, with the sharp, glittery spikes of synthesizers that feel imported from between 82 and 86, what worked is that their melodic grooves and their interplay was always at the forefront of the mix and carried a lot of tone and body. They might not have modulated as much as they probably should have, but the reason that those hooks were so damn sticky was because the foundational synth melody took precedence over everything, especially a lot of the percussion, and that was a big thing to do in synthpop at the time. So naturally, the next big thing is for Greg Kurstin to pile on the buzzy waves that carry more texture than actual melodic tone, and then push his drums and percussion more to the forefront, not only muting some of those brighter synth lines, but de-emphasizing their presence in the larger mix. In other words, he's doing exactly what he's done but with less reverb to a slew of acts across all genres, and they have been effectively diminished as a result. And unfortunately, it's all over this album. You have songs like Forever and Graves that start off with a pretty promising synth progression, but before long we get waves of murky, buzzy, mid-range texture and overblown drums from Greg Kurstin himself, seeking to turn the song into a gigantic amorphous mass rather than something with actual greater tune or groove. And you know what, in theory, I get why this can make some sense. CHVRCHES has never been a subtle band, so why not pump up their sound to the largest size yet? But if you're gonna drown out the mid to high range synths that carried your most recognizable counterpoint melody to Lauren Mayberry's vocals, the songs just will not feel as memorable. The hooks are not as sticky. Hell, as much as I might think Wonderland is the best song on this album as the closer, for at least keeping the pre-chorus progression and hook feeling pretty vibrant, it still feels overweight and really lumbering on that hook, which really compromised any sense of greater groove groove, and that's a big problem across the majority of this album. Of course, that's before you get to the synth choices themselves. The oily, gurgling, often minor key tones that if they don't sound like they're sliding off key, they just lend many of these songs a sourness that's really hard to escape. And what's alarming is that this happens on some of the few tracks that CHVRCHES produced themselves, like God's Plan, and throughout parts of the more minimalistic Really Gone. Hell, you would think this would actually be a good choice opposite Matt Berninger of The National showing up to guest star on My Enemy, but what could have had potential as a toxic back and forth dead relationship winds up impressively inert, making you just wonder why Matt Doherty didn't take the microphone like he did on God's Plan. Matt Berninger did not really need to be here. But the production around Lauren Mayberry's voice doesn't help either. Like many of the mixes, they wind up doubling down on the multi-track vocals to carry the melody that synths would normally supplement, but in order to compete with the hand claps and the heavier drums, her vocals are so overdubbed to a point of crispness that not only it kills any hope of greater subtlety in her delivery, but also places her in contrast to a lot of the sharper percussion lines, leaving any melody to scrabble just for air in the background. Now, that's not saying that there aren't some hooks that do kind of fight through all this. With a better mix, I could definitely hear the potential behind Forever or Graves or perhaps even Heaven and Hell, so maybe live they will sound a lot better, but even then, they don't come close to the best of their previous two albums. Not a single hook on this album, and that's a big problem. And as to the lyrics, well, alright, credit where it's due. CHVRCHES do seem like they're stepping away from the template or traditional arc of their previous albums, specifically with the sharper, socially conscious subtext rising into the text at the forefront, like the critique of those who are blinded by their beliefs of the harm around them on Deliverance, or to graze for those who have the privilege to ignore some real problems that are swelling up beneath them. And since CHVRCHES has always been intensely self-aware, Wonderland serves as a great closing moment where Lauren Mayberry realizes she needs to pull her head out of the clouds and refocus on real problems in the real world. But what becomes really frustrating about Love Is Dead is less that it's repeating a thematic arc and more like it doesn't have much of one at all. The breakup songs are at the center point and they're generally pretty well written and they've got some nuance, but they feel a lot more scattered and focused on the toxic situation rather than a deeper sense of introspection or reflection coming from her. And we have heard a lot of it before, which can feel kind of shallow as a result. And sure, songs like My Enemy and Forever and the melancholy of Really Gone, they do have some balanced weight to them, but when you set them opposite hooks that lean really heavily on repeated phrases or syllables to fill up space, it feels like the biggest play for pop radio came in stripping back the lyrics to a much more basic form, or at the very least making some individual cuts feel more accessible, which again, wasn't really needed, especially as CHVRCHES have been plenty direct in their content before. I have no idea why they decided to strip this area down, but as a whole, no, I'm not going to mince words here. This was a big disappointment for me. And while Greg Kurstin's getting a lot of the blame for pushing a production style that did not flatter the group and basically trying to make this sound like more of a Sia record, they basically hold a lot of significant responsibility for flattening a lot of their sound and stripping out the melodic flair that made them so damn compelling in the past. And with a lot of less interesting lyrics or hooks, even Lauren Mayberry can't save much of this album. So it's getting a strong 6 out of 10 and only a recommendation for a lot of the fans. But even fair warning to them, and considering I am a fan, this will not be as good or as memorable as their past two albums. I mean, it's not bad. Again, it's still decent, it's still listenable, but I was reminded way too much of the Wombats' last synthpop record from earlier this year, Beautiful People Will Ruin Your Life, which also tried to blow up their sound to the biggest extent for more sweep and presence, and wound up all the more shallow and really forgettable as a result. And really, at this point, I think both groups deserve better. But if you're curious, worth a listen. If that. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I'm kind of negative on this, but folks, this was a big disappointment. I was really hoping this is going to be better, and I cannot blame Greg Kurstin for all of this as much as I might want to. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. You want to buy the record? Link down there below. Polls up there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help support this channel, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. Make sure to actually go into the Google Doc in order to add things. You want to see a schedule? It's on my Instagram, link down there below. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.